Right. Sounds good. I am not seeing too many more folks join on, so I think we could just go ahead and get started. I want to first thank everybody for showing up in the evening on a Tuesday to come and join us to learn about cumulative impacts. We really appreciate you all coming to learn about some environmental justice laws that have passed in the last 2 years. So we are excited to kind of get stuff started. I am going to ask for the next slide, please. Awesome. Just a little agenda for us today so that we know what we're up to. We're going to just be doing some introductions, a little bit of a grounding moment. From there, talk a little bit about how cumulative impacts does relate to environmental racism here in the state of Minnesota. Along with that, we're going to hear from Kathleen from Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate on air pollution impacting our health, and pass it on over to the lovely Jo Vital to talk about some lovely campaigns that have been going on against big polluters, and finally end it with the rulemaking process. Where's the law at now, and how can we all get involved as community members? So we have a pretty stacked agenda, and after that, we're going to have some space for questions and answers. So if you have any questions that are either coming up during the presentation or afterwards, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll make sure to answer them as we can at the end. So next slide, please. On top of introducing yourselves in the chat, we're also having a little bit of a fun icebreaker here. We have a lovely selection of alpacas here. And so we're asking folks to, in the chat, drop which one you are feeling like today. I'm loving it. 8. Yeah, I honestly feel like 9, not to be a bummer, but I'm feeling a little bit like 9 right now. So yeah, if folks just want to drop their answers like that. And I'm going to ask folks once more to please mute once you enter the space so that we don't have any interference. And we are also recording this. So that way we don't have too much noise going on for those that see this later on. I'm loving all the answers, all the responses. Give it another minute for folks. Thank you for participating in our silliness here. Love it. Sweet. Thanks so much, Monse. Just a little introduction on who we are. I'll start off with myself. My name is B. I use they, them pronouns. I work with Climate Generation as their policy manager, and we're a proud member of the Frontline Communities Protection Coalition. This is an awesome group of environmental and frontline organizations working to address systemic environmental injustice here in Minnesota. This group is also very much responsible for kicking off and taking to the finish line the cumulative impacts law that we're here to talk about today as well. Some members of our coalition features Copal, Sierra Club, Clean Water Action, Cure Minnesota, Minnesota Interfaith Light and Power, and many others as well. So that's a little bit about who we are, just in case folks were wondering who this group has been. Like I mentioned before, our main goal is to really shift power from polluting corporations to our communities. And that way we can build a powerful environmental justice movement across all of Minnesota, not just the Twin Cities. So that's a little bit about our mission as well. And now that we've kind of settled in and been able to learn a little bit more about who we are and all the work that we're up to, I did want to also take a moment to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are on occupied Dakota land in Anishinaabe territory. And so I wanted to just kind of give that a moment. Land acknowledgements should go way beyond just acknowledging. We should really be supporting our Indigenous communities in any ways that we can. So hopefully the work for that doesn't just stop here. So I will then pass it on over to Sasha to talk a little bit more about our next topic about environmental racism.
Yeah, thank you, Dee, so much. Hey, everyone. My name is Sashi Lisnrell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an organizer with Copal and Clean Water Action Minnesota, working with the Frontline Communities Protection Coalition. And yeah, this webinar today is going to be talking a lot about environmental justice, the cumulative impacts law, the ways that pollution relates to health. And so it feels important to really ground ourselves in the root causes of a lot of these issues. When I pass it over to Kathleen after me, we're going to hear a lot more about health issues from pollution and the disparities in those health issues, how certain communities are really dealing with a lot more health burdens from pollution. And so we want to really set up, how does this happen? How did we come to this? What is the root cause of all of this? And, that's a huge topic that we certainly don't have time to fully dig into today, because environmental racism really digs back into the roots of this nation and the origins of this nation and what it was built upon. But just to keep it simple, I'll start with a pretty straightforward definition by the great Dr. Robert Bullard, who is often known as the father of environmental justice. Environmental racism refers to any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. Next slide, please. So when looking at environmental racism, we can really think about how did certain communities become, segregated from each other, and then how has that led to pollution and other impacts really being focused upon those communities. And just a few practices from the last, 100+ years in our country that we can really point to give a really clear picture of how this came to be. One that some people have heard of, but not everyone has, is the practice of redlining and racial covenants. This was very common back in the 19th and 20th century in America, where basically the planning bodies and governments could say, here is a map of our city, and here are the areas that Black people, people of color, are not allowed to live in. And here are the areas that they cannot build their businesses in. Here are the areas that they can go to. And that meant that certain communities became, entirely white communities. Some other communities were, majority or entirely Black or BIPOC communities. And that meant that, those communities would have differences in political power, economic power, just the ability to advocate for themselves, and were treated very differently. And then once you add on to that, the racist zoning laws, a lot of cities would designate areas that were majority BIPOC or people of color as hazardous areas, basically saying, well, a lot of BIPOC people live in this area, and so it's more dangerous, it's more hazardous, and that opens it up more easily to get zoned for industrial activity. And that meant that naturally a concentration of polluting facilities ended up in these sorts of areas. And I'll just point out the photo at the bottom that shows, a clause from a governing body back in the day that clearly says no persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants, all that stuff. But basically saying that if you're not white, you cannot live in this area, you cannot create a business in this area. And that created a lot of segregation. And then even connecting back to the differences in political power, there is the concept known as NIMBYism, or not in my backyardism, where basically certain communities would say, well, we don't want this polluting facility near us. And, if they had the political power and the social capital to put that pressure on the decision makers, then they could oftentimes get that stopped. And a lot of that power was concentrated in the white communities. And that meant that a lot of the communities that these facilities were forced upon were lower income and majority BIPOC. And then adding another layer on top of that, especially when a lot of these decisions were being made, most of the people in political power were white, if not all of them were white. And so, of course, they were going to favor their own communities, the people that, were donating the most to them, the people that they saw as being superior to the other communities. And so all of this layers on top of it with, again, many other factors involved to create certain communities that have lasted for generations, where pollution has been severely concentrated, and the hazards of living next to those have, been a burden on those communities for generations. Next slide, please. So just to look at some examples of how does this look in practice. I already mentioned there's a high concentration of polluting facilities in low income and BIPOC communities. And that means that the people living there are going to be breathing in poor air, maybe drinking poor water for years on end. And that has, an increased impact on your health, which then has an impact on your lifestyle. An example would be a lot of children would have asthma in communities like this, and then they might miss school, or the pollutants that they are breathing in or consuming might lead them to have worse development mentally. And again, this has a cascading effect over time that can ruin communities in a lot of different ways. Another clear example is highway construction through disadvantaged communities. And I included a photo at the bottom right of the original construction of the I-94 highway. through the Rondo community, which was a thriving Black community back in the day in St. Paul. And then the government decided that they wanted to put the I-94 highway straight through that community. And they used eminent domain to claim all of the land and forced a lot of people off of there, forced a number of Black-owned businesses to shut down. And so that ended up with the community being bisected, cut in half. A lot of people lost their jobs, their houses, and then the people that remain in that community have been breathing the air pollution from, all the cars and trucks passing by every single day for the decades since. Another example is inaccessible zoning and planning processes where the decision makers are just not, inviting environmental justice communities into the process. They're not making it accessible. Maybe it's there's a public meeting about a thing, but it's only happening during the workday. And so only people who can get, childcare or who don't have a 9 to 5 job are able to attend that. Just kind of a general sense is like looking at it in the lens of the benefits going to white communities and the costs going to BIPOC communities. You can say that like the local communities in general have, maybe benefited a little bit from the highway because everyone has been able to access it, but it's also a lot of the benefits are going to, people who own cars, tending towards a lot of the richer, whiter communities. And again, pretty much all of the cost is being put upon the low income and majority BIPOC communities. And then you have, lack of urban planning and investment in EJ communities. An example is a lack of tree cover. Especially as we're seeing climate change, we're seeing a lot more of the urban heat island effect, where if there's not much tree cover to absorb a lot of the sunlight, and it's mostly concrete that is bouncing around the sun, that creates a heat bubble that is severely worse than in areas that have a lot better tree cover. And then the last one I'll mention is just a failure to hold polluters accountable, which again kind of connects back to that political willpower. So if a white community is dealing with a polluter that is maybe over polluting or has done something to harm the local community, then they have a better chance of getting a regulatory body to listen to them because they are, in some eyes, a more politically important community. Whereas if it's a community that is majority BIPOC, majority low income, they're going to have a harder time even knowing about the systems where they can lodge complaints, let alone having those complaints be taken seriously. Next slide. So all of this kind of comes together into why we passed the 2023 Cumulative Impacts Law and what that law does. I'm going to try to be mindful of my own time because this is something I can talk about for a while, and we will have room for questions again. So if there's anything that you want me to cover more in depth, we can definitely take a look at that at the end of the presentation. But the Cumulative Impacts Law was passed in 2023. Like we mentioned, it was an effort from our coalition, a number of community groups and organizations, and a bunch of people, allies, really pushing for this law to get passed. And to start with explaining how it works, I'm going to try to kind of paint the geographic picture because that is a really important aspect of this law. Originally, the intention of this law was to be statewide because environmental justice is not just an urban issue. There are low-income communities, there are immigrant communities, BIPOC communities in rural areas that are also dealing with the impacts of disproportionate burdens of pollution. But because of political dynamics, the law that passed in 2023 only covers the 7-county metro area, as shown in the left image, and then the cities of Rochester and Duluth in the right images, as well as there's an opportunity for the tribes that are federally recognized in Minnesota to opt into the process. And then within those areas, the law defines the environmental justice areas. These are basically census tracts where there's either 35% or more low income, 40% or more BIPOC, 40% or more low English proficiency, or the federally recognized tribes, like I mentioned. And so those are the darker blue areas that you can see on this map. You can see that, in the Twin Cities, there's a good chunk of them. And then there's, a few less in Rochester and Duluth. But those are the census tracts that are counted as environmental justice communities. And this law applies to any like industrial facilities or facilities with certain kinds of air permits that are either within those census tracts, those dark blue areas, or within 1 mile of those areas, which is the light blue that you can see on the maps. And that's because air pollution does not just stay where it is. It does not only impact those who are right next to it, it can impact those who are in the region. And so we wanted to make sure that this law could regulate those facilities that might not be directly within one of those dark blue areas, but is, maybe a couple blocks or like half a mile away. And the people in that community are still breathing that toxic air. Next slide. So, what does the cumulative impacts law do? And again, this is going to be a lot, so I'm going to try to keep it relatively simple, and we can dig into any specifics that folks would like to. I also always have to give the disclaimer that this law is currently going through the process known as rulemaking, where the regulatory body, in this case, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, is going to create rules that will clarify how they implement this law. So there are certain parts of the law that are already set in stone, and there are certain parts that are currently being developed, which is why we're glad to have so many people here who can help us advocate for the rules to be strong and protective. But it just means that there are certain parts that of this law and how it'll work that are not yet defined. But like I mentioned, the law starts out by defining these environmental justice areas, and it adds regulatory protections to the areas that are in the Twin Cities, Rochester and Duluth, as well as the opt-in for the tribes, where basically if an industrial facility is in either one of those dark blue or light blue areas, if it's within an EJ area or within 1 mile of an EJ area, if it's either a new facility or it's an existing facility that wants to expand its permit or just reissue its current permit, then it could be subject to conducting a cumulative impacts analysis, where we'd have to look at how overburdened is the community itself in the area. What are the other sources of pollution in the area that are contributing to the health burdens or the environmental burdens in that area? And how is this facility going to contribute to that? The process for doing the analysis is still one of those parts in rulemaking that'll be clarified later. But that analysis will help us get a much better sense of the true impact of industrial facilities in our area. Because right now, most of our regulations just say, as long as you're below these levels, then you're fine. Here's your permit. And that means that you might have a bunch of different facilities that are all just below a limit in one area. And, in the aggregate, that is a huge amount of pollution in a very concentrated area. And that really gets to the heart of cumulative impacts, is to get a better understanding of the true impacts of these facilities and to regulate them within that context. So a facility that does this analysis would then have to determine if they meet the definition of substantial adverse impact. And that just is another thing that we're defining in rulemaking. So I can't say exactly what that will look like, but this is one of the most important parts of the rule, where it's basically saying this facility is having a certain level of impact on the community that we think as Minnesotans is not acceptable. Or if it is acceptable, it's only under certain conditions. And so if a facility does this analysis and the analysis shows that they are having that level of impact, the only way that facility can still get permitted in that community is if they enter into a community benefit agreement with the impacted community. The goal of this law really is to give that sort of agency, that sort of decision-making power to historically marginalized and overburdened communities, where if, again, a facility is having a level of impact on them, they can either say, okay, well, we see the level of impact that this study is showing, and we understand that our health is already in a bad case and is being made worse by this facility, and we do not want this facility here, in which case they would reject a community benefit agreement and the facility would lose its permit. Or they could say, we have seen the analysis, we see that, there's a harm to our health and our environment, and we understand that. And we also think that the benefit of having this facility here is worth it, as long as we get these legally mandated benefits. Again, the process for determining a community benefit agreement is still being created. So it could look like a number of different things, but the ultimate goal is to give communities that choice of either rejecting polluting facilities, or if they're going to accept polluting facilities, to get legally mandated benefits. And now, with all of that information dump, I will go ahead and throw it over to Kathleen Schuler to talk a little bit more about the health impacts of pollution.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Kathleen Schuler. I'm a public health professional, and I serve as State Policy Director with Health Professionals for Healthy Climate. Next slide, please. So you've probably heard that Minnesota is one of the healthiest states in the nation. Unfortunately, we have some of the greatest health disparities between BIPOC and white people in the country. So compared to white Minnesotans, people of color in Minnesota face a higher incidence of infant and maternal mortality, heart disease, cancer, asthma, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. Also, a shorter life expectancy. So people of color in Minnesota have a shorter life expectancy than white Minnesotans. A very striking statistic is that Black and American Indian infants are twice as likely to die before their first birthday compared with white infants. These are health disparities that were created by some of the institutions and policies that we set up that have provided greater exposure to pollution that Sasha covered. Next slide, please. So as a public health professional, we look at social determinants of health. People who have higher education and are wealthier are generally healthier. So people of lower income experience poorer health in general because of the stressors that they have to deal with. We have disparities in employment and income between BIPOC people and white people. Healthcare access is another factor that is a social determinant of health. And also the social and community context. Do people live in a community where they have social supports, or are they isolated? And then finally, your neighborhood and your built environment is really important. Do people have housing? What is the quality of the housing? Do they have lead in the paint? Do they have mold and other things that can impact their health? Safety is an important factor. So crime, it's definitely a stressor. Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Access to green space and parks is really important, especially with climate change. And finally, food access. We have food deserts in some communities, and that's an important factor with health. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Your likelihood of living near a facility that emits pollution at a level above health guidelines is higher if you are a person of color, indigenous, or lower income. So the statewide average for living near a polluting facility is 6% of people. For low-income people, it's 9%, but for BIPOC people, it is 14%. So we know that this is happening in Minnesota, that people of color and lower income people are living near polluting facilities. Next slide, please. Also, this is another MPCA graphic. The air pollution risk is also greater for people of color. So for the percentage of people, of Minnesota residents who live with air pollution in excess of the risk guidelines, so air pollution that is going to impact their health adversely, the statewide average is 36% of people. For low-income people, it's 53%, and for indigenous and people of color, it's 78%. And Sasha talked about the siting of highways and other transportation facilities that emit traffic pollution in communities of color. Also the siting of polluting industries. So if you look at a couple of EJ facilities, or I'm sorry, communities that have higher proportions of BIPOC people in North Minneapolis and Phillips, compared with a whiter, higher income neighborhood, one measure you can look at is the hazardous waste reporting sites. So the Environmental Protection Agency requires companies that use certain hazardous chemicals to report to the federal government. In zip code 55411, which is North Minneapolis, they have 279 hazardous chemical reporting sites. In Phillips, they have 207. But in Linden Hills, South Minneapolis, they have 54, and Linden Hills is 90% white community, much higher income. So we can see just by that one measure that there's a higher pollution exposure. Next slide, please. So air pollution is one of the factors that really adversely impacts health. Every part of the human body is impacted by air pollution, beginning with the brain. Higher risk of stroke from exposure to air pollution is one of the outcomes. It also affects brain development, especially women that are exposed to air pollution during pregnancy can result in developmental problems in children. It clearly impacts your respiratory system and can exacerbate asthma. It impacts your heart and how your heart functions, and is linked with hypertension and other cardiovascular effects. Affects your kidneys and also reproductive system. There's studies showing that there's a higher risk for low birth weight infants when a mom is exposed to air pollution during pregnancy. The next slide, please. So our two agencies, the Minnesota Department of Health and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, periodically issue the Life and Breath Report. And they recently updated for 2022, and they were looking at air pollution in the metro area. So this is what they've reported for the metro area, that air pollution is responsible for 1,600 premature deaths, which are 10% of premature deaths in 2015, and also 500 hospitalizations and ER visits for heart and lung conditions are attributed to PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that's very small that you can breathe into your lungs and is the most harmful, and also ozone. And were for BIPOC, low income, people with disabilities. And the zip codes with the largest times the rate of asthma, ER visits. Slide, please. And also, so the next slide is the greater Minnesota. So they also looked at air pollution in greater Minnesota. They had data for the three largest cities, St. Cloud, Duluth, and Rochester. And they reported that 9% of premature deaths, or 203 deaths, were attributed to air pollution. And the highest rates for death and disease were for BIPOC, low income, disability, and uninsured people. In rural areas, there are larger numbers of older people and people with chronic health conditions. And these are groups that are more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution. This data, unfortunately, does not capture some of the rural areas that aren't in those urban communities. So it doesn't capture some of the agricultural pollution that people are exposed to. For example, if you live near agricultural area, you can be exposed to pesticides, you can be exposed to nitrates, which get in the well water. And also, if you live near a factory farm or confined animal feeding operation, you can be exposed to air pollution. And all of those particular exposures can impact your health. For example, pesticides are linked with cancer, Parkinson's disease, and developmental problems. Nitrates can, in the well water, especially for infants, can cause blue baby syndrome, also harm to the thyroid, and linked to cancer and poor pregnancy outcomes. And then confined animal feeding operations create air pollution, water pollution, also soil pollution, and they're linked to chronic and acute respiratory problems. So the rural communities also are exposed. Unfortunately, they're not included in the cumulative impacts law right now. So in summary, I'd just like to say that our structural racism in Minnesota, as throughout the country, impacts BIPOC and lower income people. And over their lifetime, they are exposed to higher levels of air pollution that harms their health. We hope that the cumulative impacts law, which is designed to reduce exposure to pollution, will hopefully result in improved health for these populations and also give communities more power in decisions that affect the health of their community. And so with that, I will pass it off to Joe Vital to talk about his work in the East Phillips community.
No, shout out to you, Kathleen. Yeah, Buju Anin, Wajin Liju Dijinakas, Magizi Lunadem. Hello, all my relatives. My name is Joe Vital. My spirit name is South Mountain. I am an enrolled member of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians, as well as a proud Mexican. Eagle Clan, as well as my mother is Nicole Mason, and Andres Vital is my father. And yeah, I've been going at this EJ stuff for about 10 years now. And really, you know, it really stems from my indigeneity with my connection and cultural relevance to Mother Earth. There, I put myself as like a land defender because activism implies that you have a choice. And given colonialism and the impacts of capitalism on indigenous peoples since settlers came here, it's been an ongoing struggle. And, I do want to take some time, just briefly to like recognize kind of like, everybody's talked about like what the moment we're in right now and this like uncertainty. And I really hope that the takeaway that you get from my presentation on the East Phillips Urban Farm Project, as well as the shutdown of Smith Foundry, is this reminder that people power is how we get things done in solidarity, with groups, with the BIPOC frontline coalition here, and other frontline fighters in whichever fight that they may be in, because all struggles are linked. We are all combating colonialism as well as settler capitalism. So I'm just going to share my screen here. If somebody could grant me something real quick. Hell yeah. So I just wanted to start off with like the discussion of like what is the East Phillips Urban Farm Project. It's one that has been in fight for nearly 10 years now, and my coming to the project is I've only been a part of it for the past 5, and really what brought me to this fight was not one of like, I saw it and got involved. Quite literally, my community members, more importantly, my aunties, reached out to me. Shout out to Jolene and Cassie Holmes, who said like, you need to make this a focus, and you know how to navigate these government structures. So since then, since 2020, this has really been my life, my focus point. And after the murder of George Floyd, just because before that, I had a different understanding of like how you combated the system. And I really saw the value and the necessity of like the merging of autonomous groups, as well as like your NGOs, as well as government partners, on how we really truly make change happen in this world. And so I'm just going to like snag the screen right here. Don't freak out, everybody. Cool. And you're going to see yourself for like a second. Don't freak out. Okay. So I'm going to like put myself in slideshow mode. All right. We should be good now. And so an extension of what Kathleen was talking about, in order to understand why Roof Depot, you must first understand the what. And, through innovation, through struggle, there is innovation. So the East Phillips neighborhood is here located in South Minneapolis. You see its annual household income. That income actually drops to $10,000 when you think about, when you consider the Little Earth, Section 8 public housing complex that is located less than a mile away from the site. It is majority BIPOC, and right down there, we experience some of the worst health inequities in the state. We only compete with right there, North Minneapolis. You see us, and nobody wants to be in an oppressive Olympics. And so, about 10 years ago, the city of Minneapolis caught wind that the community was organizing to purchase the Roof Depot site, and as a result, threatened eminent domain with the former owner, and forced the sale to the city so that it could expand its public works Hiawatha expansion project, which would centralize all city works departments in the East Phillips neighborhood. And this was incredibly controversial, and it actually goes against the conflict of interest for the city of Minneapolis, because its proposed plan is to build this, this public facility. It's inconsistent with the city's own sustainability goals and undermine its efforts through its green zones policy, meaning that East Phillips should be a place where you green the neighborhood, that you bring renewable energy and other investment into, because it's been divested for so long. However, the Hiawatha expansion project would do the opposite of that by centralizing these diesel trucks that, albeit, do a lot of important functions across the city, such as replacing pipes to make sure, there's no lead pipes in our city, plowing our streets, all important city and normal city functions. However, you're taking away these trucks and centralizing it into a neighborhood that is already disproportionately impacted. And you can do the math. Adding diesel trucks to an area that is already facing this would make things a lot worse, and of course pissed off the neighborhood. And the why of the pissing off is incredibly important, because here I come right back to this slide, which is like, East Phillips is resilient and we shouldn't have to be. However, the Hiawatha expansion project was like the first of many fuckery on the behalf of the city of Minneapolis, where we had the Highway 55 expansion, as well as the Midtown Power Line. Many of you might not know about that, but for those of you who are frequent the Greenway, XL wanted to put a power line that would be right above the bikers' heads. And of course, the neighborhood fought against that and actually won. So they put it underground again. This isn't the only thing. There's no way to talk about the East Phillips struggle without first mentioning the arsenic triangle. East Phillips was a former Superfund site. There are still 2 households that need to have its soil replaced. And essentially what the Superfund site came from, or how the designation came about, was there was a pesticide plant that existed in the neighborhood some 50 odd years ago. And when the train tracks was used to deliver the pesticide to the rural farms, and so we had this like pesticide production in the neighborhood that used arsenic inside of its formula. It would travel, and there would be no cap to this pesticide, and so the particulates would be able to fly out, and it would slowly settle in the neighborhood. So hundreds of homes, their soil was contaminated. And if you remember back at my first slide, East Phillips is an incredibly diverse area, and it's incredibly progressive in the sense that a lot of folks are farming, and a lot of folks, especially our new relatives, our new immigrant relatives, were bringing in different farming practices. Regardless, people were outside growing their own food, and we should be supporting that. However, what they didn't know was that their soil was laced with arsenic, and so folks were slowly eating in these contaminants. And this is to add on, like Smith Foundry and bituminous roadways were also active in the neighborhood, which were either emitting lead, that we soon to find out, by bituminous roadways being an asphalt plant, also probably allowing other particulates to settle on the neighborhood. So people were just consuming this, and rightfully so. They were pissed and complained to our government with no legal standing. I'll talk more about Smith Foundry, but the reason why the cumulative impacts rulemaking is so incredible on behalf of its success is because, and just making it happen, was that neighborhood didn't have a legal infrastructure or lever to use to shut down these sites or to stop the permitting process for these horrible projects. Because they benefit the rich, or more importantly, it's in mode of extractive capitalism. And so we do have to I do need to shout out my mentor, Karen Clark, which, her in Berglund passed a state law in 2008, which required, any new air permitting to require stricter analysis, to the impacts of new projects in the neighborhood. However, there was no teeth to actually stop the projects that were going through. So that's what was frustrating. However, Karen and Berglund's interpretation of the law was quite different, which added into a legal case that we put upon the city later on. And so I do want to talk about Roof Depot, and kind of, some of you might have heard about it and you've heard me mention it in this presentation, but what exactly is it? It's 5.7 acres of land, but about 3 acres of it is this building. It does not look this cool right now. I wish, but this is kind of a rendering of how we want to, how the community wants to develop the site. Right now, it is an abandoned warehouse, and it's been abandoned for 15 odd years. And since then, the city's kind of has stripped it of, its wiring, copper, etc., and has prepped it for demolition. And the entire, again, this conflict of interests, and the economic development of the site, just in constant clashes with the city, just because the community has wanted something else. It's wanted to turn this vacant warehouse into what you're seeing right here, which is a community-owned, climate resilient, business generating mixed-use development project that is powered by solar. We got taco trucks. I'm seeing people biking, but and to sum it up, Roof Depot is just the wishes of the neighborhood. You heard me talking that for the last 100 years, whether it's the state or the city or the county, these government entities that we've entrusted with the, safety and well-being of our residents or its citizens, has just been poo-pooing on this neighborhood. And so, folks got to imagine, how would they protect themselves? What is a safe space for them where they can be them? And in came, what you're seeing here. It's not, EPNI has been the steward of this project for 10 years. However, this idea of the Roof Depot project stemmed from the neighborhood. And I'll go over it quickly. The city of Minneapolis, back when it, threatened eminent domain, it went back to the community and basically said, hey, let's have a meeting. So there was a community meeting. And in this community meeting, the city said, okay, we're taking this building and we are demoing it. No buts, no anything. But we got you. We'll allow you to pick out which shrubs you want and let us know, A or B. And you can imagine neighbors were rightfully pissed and told them, no, we have option C, which is what, Roof Depot was. And they took it over, and that was one of 2 community meetings the city ever held. The second one would happen in 2022. So that community meeting took place in 2013, and it'd be that much longer until they had it again. And that was just to describe what the, what the alternative plans for the site would be. And that was done through Jason Chavez for transparency purposes. So shout out to him. And, I showcased, we saw all the bubbles of inequality. And so, business incubation, solar panels, a safe space or a public place for residents just to hang out and to be in space with each other without having to spend a dime. This is all ideas that came from the community, because it's in conflict with capitalism. Because nowadays, if you can think about it really hard, besides a library, where can you exist for free, where you don't have to spend a dime? Whenever you want to hang out with your buddy or catch up with your friend, I imagine you're like, let's go get a bite. Let's go grab a drink. Let's go get coffee, right? always spending something. And so the community was thinking, no, we want local businesses because we have entrepreneurs that, can't afford the, market rate spaces, that are just on Lake Street or downtown. We want to bring the economy here. And then we also don't want to have to spend money. We could just simply be in space. We want this space powered by clean energy, and we want that to be a circular economy that goes in and through the neighborhood. And so you're kind of seeing at the top right here, which is super cute. It took place in 2014, which is one of the first rallies that took place. But I do want to highlight the kids that are in this that picture, because oftentimes you're hearing from crappers like me, but shout out to me. But really, the youth have a testament that they are advocating for, and this whole project is meant for the next 7 generations, because we want to build our business, we want renewable energy, but more importantly, we want a healthy green neighborhood for our next generations. We don't want kids developing asthma or other respiratory problems and losing them when they're in their teens, and that has happened to so many of our neighbors. It shouldn't be radical to want your kids to grow old. And so, with that, we've been leading the charge, taking the fight to City Hall, taking the fight to the state. And since then, we've grown our movement. And these are like maybe 1,000. I remember this was like the block party, and this is like 1,000 people that are outside in the cold. I don't care if you're Minnesotan, you're like, I like the cold, but the wind chill is like something else. I don't care about that. People are outside right there because they care. And that's nestled between Little Earth. Shout out to the land back symbol right there. That's cool. Here's a breakdown of some of the important components of Roof Depot. And I want to shout out the farm aspect of the project right here that you see at the bottom left. We're utilizing aquaponics and hydroponics. And that's because East Phillips is a food desert. And we're seeing tariffs go here or there, and President Cheeto Face doesn't seem to be stopping. We need to be, and more importantly, during the pandemic, there just seemed to be a stop in the system. It's so frail, so fragile, that we need to start growing things in our neighborhoods. We should not need to go farther than a mile to be able to eat healthy greens, and we need to produce it at a cheap level or near free so that folks can afford it, because damn, everything's getting expensive. And so hydroponics and aquaponics, it's as simple as, we have fish, and then we use the fish poop to fertilize the greens so that, they have the nutrients and they grow. And then there will be some biochar being used. There will be composting on the site as well. We're really excited to, bringing this technology to East Phillips. And more importantly, it's going to be owned by the neighborhood. We have several pro bono lawyers that are helping us out. And, we're creating an ownership model where like each, renter and homeowner in the neighborhood to get one vote, more importantly, one share of the Roof Depot project, so that no one person, no one group has total control. It's a true democracy that we're bringing in. We always like exemplify it for the football heads out there. I'm not a football person, but like the Green Bay Packers. I hope that rings a bell for people. We're also exploring geothermal, rainwater recycling, wood waste utilization, and community composting. I mentioned that. Right here is the Greenway. Some of you might have frequented that. We will be developing that and then turning it into further community space as well. And then here's some partnerships. We're nothing without our partnerships, including the Frontlines Community Group. Nothing happens in a silo. EPNI might have been the charge, the face, the voice, but we're nothing without our partners. I saw Luke Gannon from Epic. I saw Evan Mulholland from MCEA. Shout out to some of my favorite people. When we fight, we win, and it takes all of us. And here's a little bit of impacts of solar. And I just want to highlight this right here. The solar on our roof, which is about 3 acres of solar, it will power 200 households in the neighborhood. So people are always worried about greenwashing. We're nearly erasing the utility cost for 200 households in our neighborhood. That's amazing. And the geothermal, we haven't been able to do a study on that, but we're hoping the cost savings increase that even more. And then again, going back to community autonomy with it being rooted in indigenous sovereignty. I mentioned the Little Earth Section 8 housing complex earlier. But that is, a lot of people think it's like reservation land. It is not reservation land. It is just where poor Native people live. But they happen to be in Minneapolis, and shout out to AIM for the creation of Little Earth. But during the 1960s, Indian Bureau agents were tricking Native people off the res. My grandpa included. This is my origin story to Minneapolis, where these Indian agents would go to reservations and tell Native folks like, hey, if you go to cities like Minneapolis, San Francisco, LA, Ohio, Cleveland, Chicago, there's going to be free housing for you. There's going to be a job. It's going to be awesome. But when Native people left, they found nothing. There was no infrastructure. There was no support for them when they ended up at these homes. So they were essentially homeless overnight. And the Bureau did this because back then, how the U.S. government interpreted treaty responsibility was the amount of Native people who lived on the reservation. So getting less people off the reservation meant less treaty responsibility. Catch my drift? AIM, during its time, during its rise, fought the U.S. government saying it needs to rectify that, and it was able to like get the creation of the Little Earth projects. Cool. Back to sovereignty and community autonomy. So, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about like how the neighborhood's been poo-pooed on for the past 100 years. It's been reversing. And EP&I and our allies have been inserting sovereignty and community autonomy in all the decisions that we make. Community meetings, how we decide what we do at the legislature with the city is all done through democracy, through a community vote. And as a result, there's been immense buy-in for this project on behalf of the, not only indigenous community, but the overall community at East Phillips. When, the city was like a week away from demolition, people put their bodies on the line and allegedly occupied the site by ripping through the fencing and taking over. And thousands of people were outside where, MPD later was forced to, evict folks from there. So, since then, it's just us recognizing the autonomy of not just only the neighborhood, but also the land and its health. We're nothing without it. And shout out to Nick Estes, Rachel Thunder, and Wayne and Bill. RIP to Bill, though. And here's just a breakdown of some of the solar. It's a 2.6 megawatt DC capacity solar plant that we got going on with our roof access. And so don't freak out. I'm going to make you look at yourself again. This right now, Roof Depot isn't ours. But, having the city agree to sell EP&I, the neighborhood, the site, has been an immense victory. And it's already had ripple effects through the neighborhood, meaning, and that has been through the shutdown of bituminous roadways in Smith Foundry. Both were major polluters in the neighborhood. And I do owe the cumulative impacts rulemaking, or that bill being passed, is kind of the surrogate actually for bituminous roadways shutting down prematurely, because they saw the writing on the wall and were like, we need to get out because we're not going to pass that. They didn't know what it looked like, but they didn't want the smoke. Smith Foundry was a little bit different, where they were like, we're going to tank this and we're going to see what we can get, because let them try us. We've been here for 100 years. What they didn't expect was to get caught. And by getting caught was back in, in May of 2024, the EPA did a surprise inspection and found out everything the neighborhood knew. Based on looking, based on the smell, like living in East Phillips, you could smell the pollution. When you biked past it, you could smell something was wrong. You could see black smoke billowing from Smith Foundry. The only people that couldn't tell what was going on was Minneapolis and the MPCA, apparently. But what the EPA found was that, Smith Foundry not only had the proper documentation of its emissions, but also that it was emitting a crazy amount of lead into the neighborhood and didn't have the proper controls for it. And fast forward a year with the MPCA saying there was no violation, but the EPA saying it was in violation of the Clean Air Act. Ultimately, the investigation on the EPA concluded that the Smith Foundry was in violation of the EPA Clean Air Act. And, just last fall, it was forced to shut down, which is a great victory for the neighborhood, for its advocacy and, its relentlessness and not giving up. And so I'll end it here where Smith Foundry, bituminous, Roof Depot, whatever it is. I hope what you take away from my long rant is that people power gets it done. Solidarity, is the way, we are going through some untried times, but if East Phillips can clean itself up, and getting major polluters out, there's no telling what we can do. Just make sure you have smart people like Sasha and B backing you up so you know what you're talking about and that you have the expertise to make things happen. And then last thing is that don't think you need to be the expert. Don't think you need to be making a big splash. Simply showing up tonight and learning and sharing information, you don't know how far that's going to go. You don't realize how many minds you're going to change. And so with that, I'm going to end my rant and pass it over to B. Shout out to you all for sharing space. Thank you for coming here. Take it off, B.
Thanks so much, Joe. As someone from South Minneapolis, it's really great to see the work that you've been doing with East Phillips. Thank you so much for just being here and talking about the work you've been doing and the neighborhood's been doing. That part of storytelling is super crucial to any movement work, so we always appreciate it. And like Joe was saying, it's going to take a movement for us to really get a lot of stuff done here in Minnesota, and that's kind of where we are talking about rulemaking and the role that you all could play in rulemaking as well. But before we talk about what rulemaking is and like how you can get involved, it's a little bit important to break it down first. So basically, when a bill finally becomes law, goes through our state capitol and actually passes, the work actually starts there as well. So what happens there is a process called rulemaking. It sounds pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to break it down still. Rulemaking very much involves a government agency to create and draft some rules and some guidelines into how the law will be followed and applied, followed by the facilities that are going to be going through under this and also by community members. In this case, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency will be the ones that we are working with to create these rules and guidelines for how the law will actually come into play. And so the MPCA, again, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, is very much responsible for protecting the environment and public health by regulating pollution and managing our natural resources. They also work to ensure clean water, air, and land through laws, permits, and programs. And so what we're hoping to do is continue to work with them and continue to work with you all so that we can make sure that these rules and guidelines are actually doing the work that it's supposed to do and protecting already polluted communities. So we've been going through this process for a little bit over a year now, I want to say, but I could be wrong on that. Time has just flown by, but the MPCA has done a lot of information sessions throughout the metro and in Duluth and Rochester as well. These are the areas that are going to be impacted by the cumulative impacts law. And so they've done in-person informational sessions just breaking down what cumulative impacts is, but also getting feedback from people in terms of how they want to see the law applied. And so we at the Frontline Community Protection Coalition have been attending those informational sessions. That was one of the phases that the MPCA was going through for rulemaking. And we were there attending, making sure that we were giving our feedback on how this could be applied as well. And now we're moving on to different phases, which is when the MPCA starts to draft some of these rules. They won't be set in stone. They're definitely going to be drafts. But once approved, the rule is published and enforced to ensure that the law is actually being followed. And when I say the law is actually being followed, I'm particularly naming those facilities that are polluting these communities. So just making sure that they're following the rules and making sure that community members know how they could report if they are sensing that something is going to get built in their community that's going to cause more harm than good. So we're nowhere near close to getting done with the rulemaking process. We still have about another year, I want to say. So well into 2026, we will still keep working on these rules and working on implementing this law. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for you all to get involved in this for sure. Next slide when you can, Monse. We have a couple of ways that folks can get involved through this. So one is definitely going through the MPCA website. They actually have a whole webpage dedicated to cumulative impacts. I just dropped that in the chat, but this will also be sent in a follow-up email to you all. But there's just more information on how they're getting the work done and also through the many phases that they're going to go through. But there's also a public comment as well there. So if you want to give your input on how this law should be implemented, please feel free to go. But I'm also going to drop our actual website. So as a coalition, we have a really great website, and it has a bunch of information on who we are, the work that we're doing, but also how you can get involved as well. If you go under subscribe here, you're going to actually enter into our updates to get just more information on how to get involved. So you want to get on the website, it's a great way to do it. We're also going to have some Q&A in a bit, but if you come up with questions later on that we didn't answer or just didn't come to you at the moment, we're going to leave our emails up here as well, so feel free to email us. But yeah, this is kind of what we're doing right now to get more folks involved. I will mention that on February 25th and February 26th, the MPCA will be having some midpoint check-ins around what the law is and how it's going so far. You're going to be able to find that in the website as well, but I will also drop the links to that pretty soon here, just so that folks can have access to that. But yeah, they are having some informational sessions on how that's going too. I'll drop this one for the 25th and then dropping the other one for the 26th. And I do believe this is going to be virtual again. So hopefully folks can attend this as well. But otherwise, I think that is the end of my portion of the presentation. Hopefully we went through what rulemaking was pretty well, but if not, we're going to just be entering some Q&A in case folks have any more questions, points of clarification, or just need to